Very warm welcome and good evening to all the participants. My name is Maurizio Patti and I'm here on behalf of the John Henry Newman Cultural Center. And before we start, we would like to tell you very briefly about the center, quoting Father Giussani. An authentic Christian community lives in constant relationship with the rest of humanity, whose needs it shares and with whom it perceives the problems. For the profound fraternal experience developed in it, the Christian community cannot but tend to have its own idea and its own method to face common problems, both practical and theoretical, to offer them as its own specific collaboration to all society in which it's placed. You can read the quotation on our website, John Henry Newman Cultural Center. And we have had several meetings, starting, for example, with the barrister Paul Diamond, understanding the new government guidance on RSE. We had a meeting from Tokyo organized by Dr. Gabriele Di Comite about Takashi Nagai, who was a Japanese from the Shinto tradition. Through materialism, positivism, he converted to Catholicism just after the bombing of Nagasaki on the 9th of August. And then Giorgio Ponte, a teacher, a journalist, a writer, who talked about the gender ideology. And tonight we are very, very happy to have with us Jack Valero, is a press officer for Opus Dei in the UK and co-founder of Catholic Voices, a communication project that trains lay Catholics to speak about controversial issues of the Church on TV and radio. In 2010, Jack was the press officer for the beatification of Cardinal Newman during the papal visit of Benedict XVI to Britain. And in 2019, he was again press officer for the canonization of the Blessed John Henry Newman in Rome by Pope Francis. So I'm really delighted and very happy to pass the word over to Jack Valero. Thank you very much and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you. And it's great to be here talking to you. I'm going to share my screen and give a presentation. And then after the presentation, you can ask any questions you like. And Maurizio will tell us how we're going to ask the questions. But here we are. So let me run this presentation. Okay. So when I became press officer for the canonization, which was 9 years after we had done it for the beatification, I had this idea that we had to communicate Newman to a secular audience, because most people in this country are not Catholic and maybe don't understand religion or Christianity. And so this was the challenge, how to do that. Newman, as you know, makes a very important person in Britain, was born in a place very near the Bank of England, where the Bank of England is now, in 1801, and died towards the end of the 19th century in 1890 in Birmingham. And he's here buried with his brothers from the oratory in a tomb, like every other tomb in that garden of the summer house of the Oratorians in Birmingham. So basically, he lived throughout the 19th century, and he was a very important person in Britain. So we had this objective to show that Newman's canonization was more than just a Catholic celebration, because if it was reduced to a Catholic celebration, then it wouldn't have the impact it should have, because Newman was a really important person of the 19th century, and now he was going to become a saint of the Catholic Church. So putting the two together, let's use this opportunity to show to people that he was very important. So how do we do that? Well, we thought of several things, but in the end, the thing we did was, let's find out in what ways Newman is relevant to today, to people in 2019, in 2020. And the amazing thing was what we found, that he was relevant to people right now in the present time in several ways, more than one way. In the end, I came up with 9, and this is what I would like to go through now. But isn't that interesting that he's important to us as Catholics, or to me as a Catholic, and as a devotee of Newman, who had read a lot and understand more than the average about what he was trying to do and what he did, but also to lots of other people in different ways. And so this was good news, that we had all these areas of connection with ordinary people. And so we should understand them. The first area was education. Here's a man who started a university. Not many people can say they started a university. And he was asked to start a university for Catholics in Dublin. Ireland and England were one country at that time in the 19th century. And Catholics had only been legal in these islands or free since 1829, not very long. We're now in the middle of the 19th century, barely some few decades later. But by then, because it had been proscribed to be forbidden to be Catholic for so long, that they weren't going to universities or even to good schools. So he eventually, he thought this was a very big gap, and eventually he was asked to start this university in Dublin, and he gave a few lectures about what a university should be. And these lectures were collected into a book called The Idea of a University. And the funny thing is that this book, which was written 150 years ago, is still a book that is discussed to this day in universities like Oxford. I remember when I was asked to be the press officer, I was in a party in Oxford a few days later, talking to a group of people about, and we each were saying what we were doing. None of them were Catholic or even religious. And one of them was an active proselytizing atheist, not Richard Dawkins, but one like him. And when I said I was going to do that, he said, "Oh, we were just discussing in my college the idea of a university, one point from it, in the meeting we had last week." So here's an amazing thing, that this book is being discussed to this day, and these ideas that university education cannot be just training for a job, but that should be the broadening of the mind in all sorts of ways, and the deepening of education, what it means. All those ideas we're still discussing. So here's a way for Newman to be of influence today, where he continues to be of influence, and he can be important. He not only did the theory, but he actually made it happen, which is quite unusual for somebody who knows how, is active in the world of ideas, that he can actually pay the bills, get the teachers, organize the rota and the classes and everything. But he did that. He was a very practical man as well as very intellectual man. And when he had done that, he realized, well, this took him a few years, where he used to commute from Birmingham to Dublin. And then he said, well, Catholics actually they don't get a good school education to get into the best universities. So we have to start a school. Other people will need to do it, but now he did it himself. And he wanted this idea. It must be the best school in the country. If we're going to run society, we must educate our children, our boys, it was then, in the best possible way. A kind of Catholic Eton, which is what he had in mind. when he started the oratory school, which continues to this day. And again, he proved himself to be a very practical man, not just to know how a school should run, which is something he wrote about, but actually running one and getting over all the problems and of staff leaving, all the problems we find today in running schools. He probably met and resolved. There's a book, a very important book, a very interesting book by Paul Shrimpton, a Catholic Eton, Newman's Oratory School, on how he did that. So that's the first thing, education, very important for this country. Newman was very important in the area of education. Then another big area is the area of conscience. The key thing here was the Vatican Council, First Vatican Council. This drawing is of the First Vatican Council and Pius IX. The First Vatican Council met and were going to discuss a number of things. The first of which was the infallibility of the Pope. But once they had done that, then there was the Franco-Prussian invasion of Rome, and the council was stopped and didn't really start again until Vatican II. So very few things were actually decided. But one of them was this. And Gladstone, who had been prime minister at the time and had lost the election and had a lot of time in his hands, wrote this leaflet, famous leaflet pamphlet saying, well, now that the Pope has been declared to be infallible, clearly Catholics cannot be in public life because they will be told what to do from outside by the Pope, and they won't be able to think for themselves. And well, this was frightening because it came from a very important person, and they'd only been in public life a decade or two since he was allowed to be Catholic. So it was quite frightening. So they asked people in general asked Newman to answer this because he was a friend of Gladstone, but also because he was a towering intellectual. And he wrote this reply to Gladstone called the Letter to the Duke of Norfolk. This is how they used to do it. Anyway, this 60-page booklet, which is really up to date, it's an amazing leaflet, a booklet explaining that Catholics did not obey blindly the Pope or indeed anything, but they had formed their conscience well so that they could act in the best possible way, because their conscience was the way that God spoke to them. And when you have a good, well-formed conscience, then you do things that are moral and good. And of course, you get a lot of information from the church and formation, and this feeds your conscience to act as well as possible. But for him, unlike for us that we think conscience somebody says, oh, I will follow my conscience, meaning I will disobey the church. This isn't what Newman had in mind. Newman had in mind, I will follow my conscience, meaning I will be moved by God to do good things with my life in a positive way. This had an immense impact. Well, the letter itself, which I recommend everybody to read if they can, did clear for me, for example, when I read it, some problems I had with 19th century popes who used to say things that I considered to be unusual, things about politics, like you cannot be a liberal in politics, or you cannot do this, or you cannot believe in freedom of religion, and then Newman says, well, you have to distinguish. In the book, he explains it very well between what is perennial doctrines and what is political solutions that are applicable now, but not later. Because, for example, the popes used to run a country called the Papal States that they no longer do. And so all those things to do with that. And also Europe had a political situation, which is no longer the case, which is different now. And now we are being told different things, which are also, some are perennial and some are things of the moment. He makes this distinction very well, a very important distinction. But what I said was, this is a call to do things, to action in conscience, not a call to reject things that you hear in the church. On the contrary. And a very great example is the example of Sophie Scholl. This is the 22-year-old girl from Munich who, with her brother and friends, formed the White Rose movement to oppose Hitler. And they were caught and they were tried and executed the next day. And then many years later, it turned out that they had been reading Newman on conscience, who had inspired them to active resistance of Nazism and to give their lives. So this is the kind of conscience that Newman was thinking about, that it will lead you to reject evil and do good. And that very interesting thing, here is, you have Brave New World, a book in the 1920s, written by Aldous Huxley, who was an atheist. And it's a very interesting book, a dystopia, some of which has become true nowadays, when we are making babies in test tubes and babies to order and various other things. And here you have alpha males, beta males, gamma males, depending on how much money you have or who, you know, what you want the baby for, you can order them to different specifications. But at some point in this book, the controller of the world is explaining to the hero that in order to keep people happy with this new world, with this dystopia, they have to be drugged they have to be on drugs all the time and sort of semi-conscious, but also they're not allowed to read certain very dangerous books, because these books will make them realize the truth. And for example, the Bible or Shakespeare. But and then he goes to his safe and says, look, here are the few books that we have absolutely forbidden anybody to read. We keep them locked up. And there he found the Bible and Shakespeare, but also the books of Newman, which is an amazing thing. Newman had died in 1890. This is 1920s, sorry, barely 25, 30 years later. And here you have this atheistic author saying that Newman was dangerous. If you read Newman, he made you see the truth and made you act in conscience. I think that's very telling and very much needed today, you know, when we have to see the truth in this fake news society, this post-truth society, that we should be daring to follow our conscience. So that's a very important thing for today. Then there's friendship. You know, here's an Englishman, the most English of English people, to become a saint, and he was, and English people maybe have this reputation of being reserved, and he was quite reserved and in fact a bit prickly, and he had to struggle with this throughout his life. But here you have the altar that he used to say mass as a cardinal, and on the side wall, this is a side wall next to the altar, he put pictures of all the friends of his friends who had died, so he would pray for them. And he wrote letters, lots and lots of letters, which he would classify and reclassify, and so they were all ordered. There's 20,000 letters in 32 volumes have been, you know, put together after he died, to all sorts of people, from prime ministers, Gladstone and others, to beggars. You know, he became a friend of the beggar outside the church. The beggar gave him a handkerchief, and he kept it, and he put it around his neck, and he said to his brethren, I want to be buried with this handkerchief because he's my friend. And I think that he could be the patron of friendship, which is something that perhaps is not very well emphasized. One very interesting thing is that in one of his sermons, he says, because here's a man who's written many books, many important books, many intellectual and influential books, but he says the faith will be transmitted through friendship, from one friend to another. So here, instead of saying the faith will be transmitted by very clever people writing very clever books that people will read and say, aha, that's how it is. No, the faith will be transmitted through friendship, something that we understand much more now, or we are starting to understand, something very necessary today. And cor loquitur, he chose, heart speaks to heart, as his motto for when he became a cardinal, because for him, friendship was really at the heart of being what it meant to be Catholic. So that's the third thing. Fourth, the laity. And you see, so far we've said very big things, education, conscience, friendship. The laity, he had this idea of the laity. This quote is very, very famous. I think that his idea of the laity probably 100 years ahead of his time. When he said these things, people didn't understand him or didn't agree with him, or they said, okay, yes. But in fact, they didn't really grasp it, because it was only with the Second Vatican Council that people understood that the laity were not just coming to church, or not just in the church, or not just very devout people, but they had to be well formed. They had to know history, canon law, liturgy. They had to know many things. They had in their hands the conversion of the world. They had in their hands starting universities and schools and all the different Catholic things. They had in their hands the good running of the church, reaching all the areas that it had not reached up to then. And so that's how he saw the laity as really crucial. How the Vatican Council turned it round, because before the Second Vatican Council, you had the bishops, who were the descendants of the successors of the apostles. You had the priests, who were ordained people for the sacraments, and then you had the religious, who had made vows, and then you had the laity, who were defined as none of the above. So how good it was that you have now become a none of the above. And whereas the Vatican Council turned that around and said, well, the people of God consist of the laity, whose function it is to convert the world and bring it to God. They have their own function. Then you have the clergy, who have to help the laity to achieve that by administering the sacraments. And then you have the religious, who give the witness, the eschatological witness to the world. So it's really the other way around. This is something that Newman would have really understood. And that's why his writings on the laity are so up to date. So the fourth thing, his spiritual life, was also very modern. When he died in 1890, one of his brethren put together some prayers and devotions and meditations in a book called Meditations and Devotions, published in 1893, and it has been in print to this day. In fact, in the canonization, all the VIPs, they printed several hundred copies and gave them to the VIPs who came to the canonization, and they were printed because they've been in print. And when you read it, you find it's really helpful to this day. And this is one of the lines in one of the meditations. This is a very, very famous quote that I particularly like, that each of us has our vocation. We have been created to do some definite thing, which is not committed to anyone else. And that's such an amazing idea. So this spiritual life was very modern. And so was his theology. And his theology can also be modern, up to date, and helpful for the 21st century. He started this idea that the historical approach, let's go back to the fathers. In fact, he went back to the fathers of the church. This is his library in Birmingham. And most of these books, all of these books he bought himself, and he put them together. Most of these are from the fathers of the church. And he first read the fathers as an Anglican, and it was this reading of the fathers that led him to become a Catholic. And then the interesting thing is, he wasn't afraid of any controversial topics coming up. He would always go to the fathers and say, well, what did they say? And this is something that has been done more and more since the Vatican Council. I think that Newman has taught us how to do theology in a very rational way, not scholastic theology, which is also necessary, but in a different way, in a historical way, which can help us too. And also in the area of conscience and the role of laity, and the famous essay, Consulting the Faithful in Matters of Doctrine, which got him into trouble he wasn't afraid of this trouble because he went back to the fathers and explained what they believed and why we shouldn't be afraid of looking into what the fathers believed so we can understand our faith better. And whilst he was becoming a Catholic, he lived in Littlemore in these houses which he bought, which you see in the photo from outside and from inside, which are now looked after by an organization called The Work of nuns from Austria and Germany. And while there, he wrote this book, an essay on the development of Christian doctrine, which was so important for Catholic theology, really a turning point in Catholic theology to show that, yes, the Protestants were saying the Catholics have changed their doctrines. He said, yes, doctrines have been developed, but they have been developed according to the principles of development of Christian doctrine, which are correct, and some developments are not correct. And here is a book, quite a difficult book, but important book to explain how the doctrines develop properly, how they develop properly, and how some developments are not proper developments. So that's an important thing to this day, of course, discussed very much since the Second Vatican Council. And then the last three, which are perhaps less well known, but also to me quite interesting. He was very interested in culture, beauty, and music. For example, this is his working room, and we'd seen the library before with all his theology books. Here in his actual room, working room, he a lot of these books are either devotional books or novels. He was very keen on Sir Walter Scott, so this whole shelf of novels of Sir Walter Scott. He wanted to be really in the culture of the day. On the bit of cupboard that you don't see, there's some pages from a newspaper hanging on the campaign in Abyssinia, because he was following the newspapers very closely, what was going on in the world. And he also liked to play the violin, and the violin is there. He used to play it every day and practice a little bit. And he wrote the Dream of Gerontis, which was put to music by Elgar soon after Newman died. And poetry, beauty, music, he was very much into these areas as also a way to get to God, which is very up to date, very much what people connect to. In particular, he was connected to the modern world intellectually. He lived in the time of Marx and Darwin, and in my opinion, he was at that level of influence in society. Of course, we have heard a lot and suffered a lot from Marxism and Darwinism, so we think they're important, they're influential. But actually, Newman's ideas, he engages with these people and others. One very key idea that he engages with, which I think we will hear more about in the future, is what it means to believe. He realizes that in the modern world, even in the late 19th century, and even more so in the early 21st century, it's really difficult to believe. And then he analyzes this in his latest big book called The Grammar of Assent. Now, that's a very difficult book. But in this book, he examines this, what it is to believe, what does it mean to believe, and how does it work? And with time, this will be unpacked, and we will see that he's quite helpful in helping us face the crisis of faith that we are in at the moment. And finally, in a very practical way, he was also influential in Birmingham. The Birmingham Civic Society put up this plaque outside the oratory in 2010 when he was beatified by Pope Benedict in Birmingham, and this plaque was unveiled by the Pope. And to the canonization, among the VIPs who came to the canonization was the mayor of Birmingham, who is a Muslim, or who was a Muslim last year. I think is a yearly job. But he came and I was talking to him and he told me, oh yes, I want to come because Newman is very important to Birmingham. He helped a lot. He helped the city a lot. He would help the poor. He would worry about the workers and their rights and everything. So a man who is writing books, but he's also concerned about the real people. So that's a great combination. We prepared the canonization with these ideas in mind, trying to connect with civil society, with secular society, with all those points of contact. We put together this website with the team, the journey to sainthood, preparing for October. The announcement was very, very late. The announcement of the date was made on the 1st of July. So basically we had 3.5 months to do this work. But in a way, compressing it this way was quite helpful. We made a press release on the 1st of July. This is when we launched the website. And this press release was actually published, news from this press release in all the newspapers, the Daily Telegraph, the Times, the Daily Mail, the Guardian, Birmingham Live, the Catholic papers, BBC News, Reuters, etc. And the nice thing was that the press release was quite long. It's there in the website, but it was quoted. It was not just the news given. It was quoted. The various quotes were used. The angle, the narrative was very positive. Every paper was very positive about this event. We actually made a press conference at the Foreign Office to emphasize that Newman was important to the world and that this event would be in Rome. So here's the Cardinal and the ambassador to the Holy See, Sally Axworthy, and myself. And then on the other side of me is the lady from Clarence House who came to represent Prince Charles because he was planning to come at that point. But the interesting thing is that he also wrote an article, which I'll tell you in a minute about. We got the Oxford colleges involved because of his influence in Oxford. And so here's Trinity College, where he was an undergraduate, and they published a booklet called In St. John Henry Newman, In the Footsteps of St. John Henry Newman, a walk around Trinity College, Oxford, which they gave to every visitor from June to October and beyond. Very interesting. And they highlighted the things, and the principal of the college came to Rome alongside the principals of Oriel and various other colleges. But Prince Charles came, and here he is. And the fact that he came and wrote a piece about Newman, which was absolutely amazing piece, with all the insights about the importance of Newman for the country and for the church and for all Christians, really. And this appeared in all the newspapers. Here's the Times, in the front page of the Times, but really it appeared in all the... So I was press officer, and he made my job so much easier because he made it great, big news. It was already news, but he made it big news and big positive news. And I also got my chance to give him the book of Newman. I was tasked to give the official book to him, and he was very happy to see the book and to take it and read it to learn more about Newman, because he said then that Newman was very important. Well, just to finish, I have written a longer piece with all the things I've told you this evening, plus a few other things about the preparing for the canonization, called Communicating Newman to a Secular Audience. And this is in a publication called Church Communication and Culture in the volume of 2020 that came out in June. And so it's freely available in the internet. You can read it. And that's all. Thank you very much. So if you have any questions, I'm going to stop the sharing now, and then you are quite welcome to ask any questions or make comments or whatever. Thank you.
Jack, thank you so much. That was really an extraordinary tour de force through St. John Henry Newman's life. And it was quite significant the way that you made it relevant to a secularized world. And it was also a combination of accessible way to get familiar with his life and his experience, and at the same time was very, very deep. So thank you very much. Now I've got some questions. Could following one's own conscience lead paradoxically to do evil?
Well, I think that I already talked about this before, because when Newman speaks about conscience, he's not speaking about what some people today call conscience, because when you hear the word conscience today, sometimes you hear, oh, I know that the Pope has condemned contraception in Humane Vitae, but I follow my conscience, which means that I can use contraception and I'm okay. Well, that would be completely foreign to Newman, because for him, following your conscience meant listening to God and doing his will, not getting around what God has told you. So a bit like what I said about Sophie Scholl, she listened to God and God was telling her, you must resist this man, even though it will cost you your life. And she was executed at the age of 22. And that's a really difficult thing to do, isn't it? To follow the will of God in difficulty because your conscience tells you, or you're not going to like the guys who object to shooting people in war, if they feel in conscience they can't shoot people because it's wrong, then they have a tough time, like the guy in Hacksaw Ridge, in the film, helping many people but not actually shooting anybody. And that's very meritorious. Or saying, no, I'm not going to carry out an abortion, even though it will cost me my job, But so if of course, following your conscience, for Newman, conscience was the voice of God within. And so much so that he said that in his opinion, apart from the 5 ways of St. Thomas and the ontological proof of St. Ambrose, he thought a proof of the existence of God was that we had conscience, that God spoke to us inside of ourselves, and that meant that God existed. Of course, it's a very deep argument, but when you listen to the voice of God, he challenges you to do good. Otherwise, you're just listening to yourself. If you're saying, I'm going to follow my instinct to have the easiest possible way, that's listening to yourself. That's not conscience. Do you see the difference? So when you listen to God, he challenges you to be a good person. And that could be arduous, because it's not easy. It demands an effort to be a good person, to do good things. And this is where the voice of conscience comes in. That's why conscience is important. It's the voice of God within. It means that God exists and he is inside you.
Thank you, Jack. We have several questions. The next one, the viewer asked, I was struck by the idea of a Catholic Eton. If a strong Catholic education was needed in his times, it seems even more important nowadays. Could you expand a bit more on Newman's views on this issue? Thank you.
Yes, that's so important. So I totally agree. If you see, our life cannot be, in my opinion, going with placards to the street to protest against abortion, because that is such a negative view of life. Life must be that those who have the talent should go and run the country, and those who have the talent should go and run companies, and those who have the talent should go and run and be professors and influence the world of ideas and so on. And those who have the talent should become lawyers and influence the way that the law shapes our mind. So in order to achieve all those things in politics, the law, medicine, society, we need people who are really trained intellectually at university. And to get into the best universities, you really need people who are trained intellectually at school. And in the best possible way, humanly speaking, and in the best possible way, in a religious sense, putting the two together. Because to be a good person, the best way, to be a good Catholic is to be a good person. And to be the best for society, it's not incompatible, it's the opposite, it's the most compatible. So if we go for any less, if we say, no, okay, we can only afford poor education, then what we're saying is we're going to leave society in the hands of those who we disagree with, and we're not going to have any role in society. But that is such a defeatist attitude, so I refuse to just spend my life protesting. So I need to change the way people think, each one of us in their own area. And for this, we need the top schools. So we need people to know their faith, not just the catechism to know the catechism, but to know how that works in the law, in medicine, in politics, and so on. And how if you take politics, for example, just politics, there isn't a book that says to be a Catholic in politics, you need to do it this way, because there isn't a way. But people who are good Catholics and good politicians will be able to do that. That is very rare. People who are good Catholics and good bankers can change the system so that we don't have any financial crisis anymore. At the moment, we're at the mercy of bankers who are greedy. And so how are we going to change that? So that needs the intellectual training at university and or in the professions, and therefore at school. So it's really important. And Newman saw this. He said, if we're going to change the country and the world, we need to have people who are well prepared. Otherwise, the rich Catholics of the time, of the 19th century, all they did was hunting because they were not allowed to go to school or university. And this didn't change anything, you see? And so they were always persecuted. But he said, no, it's not enough just to complain when you're persecuted. You have to change things. So you have to start good schools. And he wasn't afraid. You see, some people say, oh, it's so expensive. But he wasn't afraid of starting things that were expensive. Because if it's the right thing, then you should do it.
Thank you. Thanks. The relationship with the Anglican Church after his conversion, what was it like?
Well, it was a terrible thing to become a Catholic if you were an Anglican, especially an Anglican cleric. So he actually lost all his friends and even some relatives. Most of his relatives wouldn't talk to him. Well, his sister never talked to him again, and he died without talking to her. So it was very sad. But he lost, let's say, most or all of his friends who were not, except the ones who became Catholics with him. And that took him a long time to recover from. So he spent decades trying to prove himself to be a good friend. As you know, I was talking about friendship. And at one point, he was accused of being a fraud by an Anglican clergyman who was also a writer. And he felt he had to defend himself and wrote Apologia pro vita sua. And it's so good that he was accused so that he could write this, because this is one of the most important books about the Anglican Church in the 19th century. We know a huge amount of the Anglican Church in the 19th century thanks to Apologia pro vita sua, which we wouldn't have known. We wouldn't have left behind this story. Anyway, about 1870s, in the 1870s, so 30 years after he converted, he got together back with Pusey and Keble, his old friends, and they reconciled, and then he was made a fellow of Trinity College, Oxford in 79. Then he was made a cardinal a few months later. So he had a very tough life for 30 years as a Catholic, but then things turned round and he recovered most of his friends. And when people understood what he had done, then he was able to recover his friends. But here's one thing that was very interesting, but there were 30 years of suffering, which is not a insignificant thing. I'm sure that any of us were told we're now facing 30 years of suffering, we would be very reluctant to take this step, But here is a thing that really struck me. When he republishes his sermons, he republishes his Catholic sermons, and then when he republishes his Anglican sermons, already as a Catholic, he changes hardly anything. I mean, one or two things, but most of the things that he publishes are unchanged sermons, because he says, what I believed then, I believe now. My belief has been a development, but I'm not denying what I believed then. I learned to be a Christian in the Anglican Church. It's really important for him to have been an Anglican for 43 years, And for us, it's really important that he was an Anglican, because he brought so much to the Catholic Church. So yes, there were problems, but luckily he overcame most of them with time.
And the next question is linked to the previous one, because did the Catholic world accept him?
Oh, well, here's another nightmare thing, because he was very big for the Anglicans, and they didn't know how to handle him. And then he left, and then he was too big for the Catholics, who tend to be small-minded people, unfortunately, because we weren't, of course, none of us were around, but the Catholics at the time were a mere minority. So, in a sense, and a persecuted minority. So maybe some were small-minded, the people who ran the show. Be that as it may, they made Newman's life quite difficult, so they didn't know what to do with him, so they gave him projects to do, but they didn't allow him to do the things that he really wanted, like setting up a college in Oxford or things like that, and then his becoming a cardinal was stopped for a while because of somebody's envy, and so he was not treated that well. But later, I think he was not treated well by the Anglicans or by the Catholics at the beginning, and then after many years he recovered friends in the Anglican Church, and he became prestigious in the Catholic Church. And once he became a cardinal, I think he basically was okay after that. For the next 10 years the last 10 years of his life were very much more calm. But I think he was a big man, too big for us, maybe. We didn't know how to handle it. But that's just, one of the trials that God put in his path for him to become a saint.
When you were talking about the education and the schools, and we had a private meeting, and you told me that many schools, many colleges, many universities in the United States, still when they are founded, they follow Cardinal Newman's teachings and direction.
No, I think the idea of a university must be a very unique book that is still being consulted 150 years later, even though it was written at a very different time. So it was very forward-looking, and some of the things that he mentions are not, they're not resolved. They're not. People have not been decided fully. Should a university be just? Should everybody study humanities? Should you have a general studies section of the university? Should you do away with vocational training and put it elsewhere, and get everybody at university to really read all the important books of civilization before they can get a degree, and even science degrees? Is specialization such a good idea? And many things that I think are still being debated to this day. So that's what I think one of his one of the things that he put in place. And then in the States, he has a huge following. You know, the two miracles for his beatification and canonization came from the United States. So there's lots of devotion to him in the United States.
Jack, thank you very much. That is
Good.
so enlightening, and really thank you for helping us to get a little bit closer to this towering figure of
Yes.
the Catholic tradition, this great saint. Thank you. And
Okay.
I take also the opportunity to invite our participants to another meeting, another Zoom meeting on the 4th of December. And the title is A Deafening Silence about Armenia. And the writer, intellectual professor, Antonia Arslan, and the professor Shoban Marshall from the University Cambridgeville in New York, they will take part in this Zoom meeting about Armenia. So on the 4th of December at 9 o'clock English time. You can find all the information, and it's been our first experience to record and to film this meeting live on YouTube, so you can watch it again. And so thank you so much, and you can still follow our activity on the website, the Cultural Center John Henry Newman. Thank you. Good night to everybody. Thank you, Jack. Thanks. Bye-bye.
See you. Bye.